Imagine for a second that you have spent the last 10 years reading every single medical textbook in existence.
Okay, I'm with you.
I mean, you have gone deep, you've memorized the anatomy charts, you know every drug interaction, you can recite the symptoms of rare diseases in, like, Latin.
Just for all intents and purposes, I am a walking encyclopedia of medicine.
Exactly. You are theoretically a genius on paper, but then for the very first time, you're thrown into an actual hospital room. Real life.
Oh, okay.
There's a patient crying in pain, a family is just, panic-stricken in the corner, and the machines are beeping like crazy.
And suddenly all that book knowledge feels a bit separate.
It feels distant.
Distant, that's a better word for it.
Right. The textbook gives you the data, but it doesn't tell you how to hold that person's hand.
No.
It doesn't tell you how to deliver bad news without just crushing their spirit. It offers the science, but not the care.
And that is a classic painful distinction. It's that massive gap between the theory of medicine and the practice of healing.
And that is the exact analogy we are starting with today. We're diving into a fascinating paper that asks the same question, but in the realm of faith.
How does high-level academic theology actually translate when you're sitting at someone's bedside in a real crisis?
It's such a critical question.
It is. We're looking at a paper titled Practical Theology and Its Importance for Islamic Theological Studies by Nazila Iskandarova. And she is really cracking open this disconnect that I think many people feel but maybe can't quite articulate.
The disconnect between the ivory tower of doctrine, the scholars in the library, and the messy, complicated lived experience of everyday people.
Precisely. Iskandarova argues that for a long time, especially in Islamic studies, the academic focus has been so heavily on the texts.
The rules, the grammar, the history.
All of it. The legal definitions. And somewhere in all that rigorous study, the actual human being standing in front of the scholar got a little lost. She introduces this concept in the paper that I think is really going to stick with you. She calls it the living human document.
The living human document. Okay, I want to put a pin in that. It sounds almost like a sci-fi concept.
It does, but it's deeply spiritual.
So the mission for this deep dive is to unpack how Islamic theology is evolving from just studying ancient pages to studying the human experience as if it were a text itself.
That's the core of it.
Yeah.
But to really appreciate the solution, this thing called practical theology, we first have to understand how we got here.
How did that gap between the text and the person get so wide in the first place?
Right, because this isn't just about scholars getting buried in books. The paper outlines a systemic historical split in how knowledge was categorized in the Muslim world.
We need to talk about these two terms, naqli and akli.
Yes, these are fundamental to understanding the history here. Islamic education traditionally sorted knowledge into two big streams. First, you've got naqli.
Okay, so let's unpack naqli. What is it?
It's revealed knowledge. So knowledge that's based on the Quran, the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, and the whole tradition.
It's knowledge that's handed down. You receive it, you don't invent it.
Exactly. God said it, I received it, I preserve it.
That's a likey.
And on the other side, you have akli, which is rational knowledge. This is knowledge acquired through human intellect, logic, observation, modern science. I figured this out.
And these two used to talk to each other, right? It wasn't always this huge divide.
Not at all. In the golden age of Islamic civilization, they were deeply intertwined. Philosophers were theologians. Scientists were religious scholars. But as Iskandarova points out, that as the modern world came in, especially with secularization efforts in places like Turkey and Egypt, this split became a chasm.
The paper mentions that these modernization efforts sort of pushed religious education into its own corner.
It was like a divorce, really. A bifurcation of the mind. State-run universities took over the modern stuff, sociology, psychology, engineering, the akli sciences.
And the religious schools, the madrasas, were left with the naqli.
They became these fortresses of tradition, often totally isolated from the social sciences.
So if you were studying religion in that context, you weren't necessarily studying how the human mind works or how societies function. You were just studying texts.
And that completely changed how they taught. The pedagogy. The system focused intensely on tafoi, which is memorization, and talqeen, the instruction of principles.
You memorize the text, you learn the rules.
But because it was cut off from the social sciences, it wasn't critically engaging with the social realities of the students themselves.
That seems like a recipe for creating graduates who are, well, brilliant at reciting 12th century legal rulings.
Which is an amazing feat of memory.
Totally. But they might be completely lost trying to help a teenager dealing with depression in the 21st century.
That is exactly the critique. The education became what she calls subject-oriented. It was all about mastering the subject matter, not about the person receiving that message.
It's our doctor from the beginning again. Knows the Latin name for the disease, but doesn't know the patient. Now, to be fair, the paper does say there were attempts to fix this. In the 1980s, you had the Islamization of knowledge movement.
Right, with big names like Ismail Raji al-Faruqi and Fazlur Rahman. They saw this problem.
So what was their solution?
They realized you couldn't have secular science over here and religion over there and expect a healthy society. So they wanted to integrate the Islamic worldview with modern sciences to bridge that gap.
But Iskandarova seems to feel they didn't quite go far enough. Why not?
Well, her argument is that even that movement stayed a bit too theoretical. It was very academic.
High-level puzzle solving.
Right. It was about how we fit these abstract ideas together. How does Islamic economics fit with modern banking theory? It wasn't asking.
How do we help this specific person who is in pain right now?
Yes. It lacked that on-the-ground application for spiritual care. It was top-down, not bottom-up.
Which brings us to the hero of our story, practical theology.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'll be honest, when I first hear that phrase, I just think, okay, here's the manual on how to pray or fast.
The how-to guide, yeah.
But the source defines it as something much bigger. It calls it a critical and public account of faith.
It is definitely not just a rulebook for rituals. It represents a huge shift in direction. If traditional theology is top-down, applying a text to people, practical theology is a two-way bridge.
It's about letting the reality of life speak back to the theology.
Exactly. And this is where that incredible metaphor comes back in. The living human document.
Okay, let's really dig into this. What does it actually mean to treat a person as a document?
It means that a human being's life, their experiences, their struggles, their joy, their trauma, has what philosophers call epistemic weight.
Epistemic weight. That is a heavy phrase. What does that mean?
Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know what we know. And usually in religion, we think the only source of knowledge is the scripture.
The holy book.
Right. But to say a person's experience has epistemic weight means that my experience of suffering is also a valid source of knowledge. It counts. It should inform how we understand faith right alongside the text.
Whoa. That is a huge shift. So you're saying we don't just read the text and apply it to the person like a stamp.
No.
You read the person and you let their reality interact with the text.
Exactly. And to do that, you need a new toolkit. You can't just use traditional interpretation or hermeneutics anymore.
Right. Hermeneutics, the science of interpreting what the words meant way back when they were written.
Mm-hmm. Traditional hermeneutics asks, what does this text mean grammatically and historically? Practical theology says you have to combine that with empirical research.
So you need psychology.
You need psychology to understand the mind. You need sociology to understand the community. You have to know what people are actually going through, not just what a text from 1,000 years ago says they should be going through.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah.
Because this sounds great in theory.
Sure. Let's take grief. A traditional approach might look at the text and say, okay, the scripture says we should have patience or sabor. So the answer to grief is patience.
And you tell the grieving person, be patient, it's God's will.
Right. But empirical psychology, the study of the living human document, tells us grief is a whole process.
Denial, anger.
Bargaining, depression, all of it. If you just tell someone to suppress that with a command to be patient, you might actually be causing long-term psychological harm.
So the living document, the person who is suffering, is telling you that your application of the text is incomplete.
Yes. So practical theology would ask, how can we interpret patience in a way that allows for the psychological reality of grief? Maybe patience isn't just silence. Maybe patience is enduring the messy process of healing.
But doesn't that get risky? I can already hear the counterargument. If you value human experience too much, don't you risk just watering down the religion?
That's the tension. Absolutely. And it's a valid concern.
Like, oh, I feel this way, so the religion has to change to suit me.
But Iskandarova isn't arguing for changing the core beliefs. She's arguing for changing the application and the understanding. If your theological model for grief is causing harm, then your theology needs to expand to accommodate the reality of how God created the human mind.
I see. It's not about rewriting the religion, it's about making sure our reading of it isn't causing harm because we're ignorant of human nature.
Precisely. And she's not just writing this from an academic desk. She mentions her own background as a spiritual care provider in a hospital.
Yeah.
basically a chaplain.
She saw this gap firsthand.
Exactly. She saw that the academic solutions she learned in school often failed because they completely ignored the patient's context.
I can imagine. If someone's dying, quoting a dense theological argument probably isn't as helpful as just listening.
Or it could be actively harmful. If the theology doesn't account for things like power dynamics or cultural diversity, it can feel oppressive.
And this is why she argues it opens the door for real Islamic spiritual care.
Yes, moving away from rigid discipline and toward the messy stuff. And one of the most powerful examples she gives is about marginalized voices,
Oh, yeah, this stood out to me. She talks about Islamic feminist theology.
which can be a charged term. But in this context, it's really about data gathering. It's a crucial application of the living human document.
How so?
Well, if theology has historically been written primarily by men in positions of power, it might just inevitably overlook the experiences of women, or the poor, or minorities, the marginalized ummah, as the paper calls them.
So how does practical theology address that?
By using empirical methods, by actually listening to the stories of, say, battered women. If there's a traditional interpretation of a text being used to justify domestic abuse,
Practical theology steps in.
it steps in and looks at the result. It looks at the bruised woman, the living document, and says, look at the damage. This suffering is evidence that our application is wrong.
Wow, that's powerful. It uses lived reality as a check and balance against the misuse of a text.
It demands that theology be ethical in practice, not just correct in theory. Iskandarova has this great line about it. She says it's about transforming the honeymoon of spiritual theory into the reality of practice.
I loved that analogy. The honeymoon versus the actual marriage.
It's so accurate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Theory is the honeymoon. Everything is perfect, ideal, abstract.
Practice is the marriage. It's work, it's messy, it's real life. You can't live in the honeymoon forever.
Eventually, you have to do the dishes. And a lot of religious education, sadly, stops at the honeymoon.
So the big question then is this actually happening anywhere, or is this just a nice idea in a paper?
No, it's happening. And what's interesting is it's happening in two very different contexts at the same time, in the West and in the Muslim world.
Okay, where in the West?
The source mentions the UK, the Netherlands, Canada, where we're seeing the rise of professional Islamic chaplaincy programs.
And these are the people working in hospitals, prisons, universities.
Yes. And their role is fascinatingly different from a traditional imam in a mosque.
How so?
Well, think about the environment. In a hospital, you're in a secular institution. You're dealing with patients who might not even be Muslim.
Or Muslims who haven't prayed in 20 years but are now terrified. Can't just issue a fatwa, a legal ruling, and walk away.
A fatwa doesn't comfort a mother who is losing a child. A fatwa doesn't help a prisoner with rehabilitation.
They're there to offer care and counseling.
They have to be. They navigate interfaith issues, mental health crises. They can't just be legal experts. They have to be soul experts.
That sounds like a much harder job, honestly.
It requires a bilingual skill set. That's what Iskandarova advocates for. You have to be fluent in the sacred texts, but you also have to be fluent in the social sciences.
You have to speak human as well as you speak theology.
That's a great way to put it.
So that's the West. What about in places like Turkey and Malaysia?
In Turkey, it's a direct response to that historical Nakli versus Akli split. Universities like Ankara and Marmara have started reintegrating lived experience into their theology faculties.
So they're teaching more than just old texts now.
A lot more. They're including psychology of religion, sociology of religion.
I saw they're even including fine arts and calligraphy. Why art?
It's actually really profound. It connects to the aesthetic and spiritual experience of faith, not just the intellectual one. It's an acknowledgement that we aren't just brains on sticks. We're emotional, visual creatures.
It's about the whole human.
It is. And in Malaysia, at the International Islamic University, they've been trying to integrate Islamic values into economics, banking, education, to produce leaders who don't have to split their brain in half.
It's closing that divide. The Nakli and the Akli are finally talking to each other again.
That's the goal, to produce religious leaders who can read the world as well as they read the Quran.
I like that. Reading the world, because the world is a text too.
It is. And if you can't read the context, your text becomes irrelevant. If you don't understand the world your flock lives in, you can't lead them.
So let's bring this home for everyone listening. Most of us aren't planning to become theologians or chaplains, but there's a broader lesson here, isn't there?
I think the biggest takeaway is about how we view our own faith or philosophy in a crisis. We often treat our beliefs as this static checklist. I believe X, Y, and Z.
And when a crisis hits, you get a diagnosis, you lose a job. Sometimes X, Y, and Z don't make you feel better.
And then people feel guilty about it. They think, my faith must be weak because the standard answers aren't working for me.
They blame themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this whole approach suggests faith isn't a checklist. It's more like a cultural linguistic framework, a language you use to navigate suffering and joy.
And like any language, it has to be flexible. It's meant to adapt.
It's meant to help you survive, not just constrict you.
It validates your own experience. It says your pain is real and it matters. If the textbook answer doesn't feel right, it doesn't mean you're a bad believer.
It might just mean the theology needs to meet you where you are. The living human document matters. Your life is a source of truth.
This has been so enlightening. It really changes how you think about the role of experts versus the role of the person actually living the life. It makes the user experience of faith just as important as the code it's written in.
It does. And it raises a final kind of provocative thought for me. We've been talking about theology, but this could apply to anything. Medicine, law, tech.
Go on.
If any field of knowledge ignores the living human document that's standing right in front of it, does it actually lose its meaning?
That is the question.
If your truth stays locked in an ivory tower, or a server room, or a law library, and it never comforts a crying mother or guides a lost child, is it failing its own mission?
Is a truth that can't be applied really a truth at all? That is definitely something to chew on.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Go out there and maybe read the living documents around you.
Take care.
See you next time.